Welcome to Soul Pod, where science meets mysticism and your inner wisdom leads the way. I'm your guide, Crystal Cassidy, and together we will bridge the seen and the unseen, science and spirituality, the practical and the profound. From quantum physics to energy centers, near-death experiences to extraterrestrial contact, join us as we delve into the mysteries of consciousness and journey together towards a more awakened, compassionate, and soul-connected world. Find your seat, drop in, and let's go on a journey together. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Soul Pod. Kat here, and we're switching roles today, having some fun. We are putting our fearless leader into the expert seat. So welcome on, Crystal.
Excited to be here, Kat.
Yeah. So today we're diving into something that's a little bit more mind-bending, but stick with us through this conversation. We are going to be diving into all things quantum. Kind of think of this episode as your Quantum 101 cheat sheet. What is it? How does it differ from classical physics? And what does any of this have to do with consciousness, meditation, and the way that we experience reality? Let's kind of start off there with what even is the point of having this conversation about physics, and how does it relate to spirituality and everything we're doing at SoulPod?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. For those of you that may not know me, I'm definitely a bit of a nerd when it comes to the science side. And the reason why this conversation of better understanding physics, and we'll be doing other episodes around other scientific kind of deep dives and how it relates to our spiritual development and our meditation habit. But it's a really exciting time in physics. The last 100 years, we've moved through all kinds of discoveries. This evolution from Newtonian physics to Einstein physics in its general relativity, and now quantum physics has actually been around for quite a while, since the time of Einstein. Today, it's really interesting in that it can help us understand ourselves more deeply. It's another path to understanding. And we talk about this a lot on the podcast, is that science in general is one way of knowing. It's one way of explaining who it is that we are and why we're here when it comes to the material. And then the spiritual experience, and they intersect in a lot of ways, which we'll talk about, but it's another way of knowing. And it's more based in the immaterial, the non-linear. And you'll notice as we get into this conversation that I'll be kind of jumping between what we call more deterministic thinking and more probabilistic thinking. And so it can really, the more that you know, I think, the more that you know about why things work the way they do, I think it can help deepen your practice and open your mind up to additional possibilities. And it kind of gives you permission. Science, in a lot of ways for me, in my journey, has given me permission to explore. And oh, okay, we are, like we talked about on the last episode, we're changing our brains in these absolutely fascinating and very, very important ways. That's another reason to meditate, the management of the stress response, and all these other reasons that are really great. And then on top of that, we can talk about the mystical and why once you taste that experience, you want to go there again. So what do you think, Kat?
Yeah, it does remind me a lot of what we spoke of last week in our episode on the science of meditation, in that bridging these two worlds offers this permission slip to fortify our practices. As we're saying, it takes anything that previously was deemed as woo-woo or, kind of just written off, and brings it down into a world with quantitative data, in a world that we can measure. And in that, it just brings so much more credit to your own experience, which, kind of like I mentioned last week, not everybody needs that. A lot of us, myself included, I feel like I very much lean into that. Well, I felt it. I know it's true. The data is just like a cherry on top, but I didn't need it. And for others, it's like a gateway into curiosity. It's a gateway into these practices and into what can lead to these mystical experiences and eventually, with that essentially a deeper understanding of our purpose, our existence on this planet, consciousness, like all of these questions that are so natural as human beings to be curious about. Like the science feels like that gateway drug into spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's so exciting that the two worlds are just more than ever interacting and like are complementary now.
Yeah. Yeah. Complementary. Two different ways of knowing. And it's exciting, right? There's mystery in both areas. There's a lot that we don't yet know on the science side. There's a lot that obviously we don't know on the mystical side. So it's a process of exploration. And for me, there's a lot of curiosity and excitement there.
Yeah.
The science is also, I like to think of it as like the human in us trying to understand us from outside of ourselves,
Yeah.
Like the spiritual experience is really understanding ourselves from within ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool way to think about it. So and we've talked about this, like this sphere, the 3D sphere of truth, and that, the ultimate truth, if you want to call it that, sits at the very center of that sphere. And we have infinite ways of perceiving it from around that truth. And so this is just another way to perceive it and to explore it.
Yeah, totally. Well, so let's start with the basics. You kind of mentioned Newtonian physics and classical physics, and how, from my understanding, that kind of gives us a framework of how to understand the physical world. But quantum physics, from my understanding, kind of flips that on its script. So what's the main difference between the two, and why is there tension there? And why is it important that we kind of address both of those worlds?
Yeah, so there is intention there. And we'll very much stick to the basics on this episode, and we'll explore it together. And we can call it the Newtonian physics. Even general relativity, it's very much about deterministic worldviews. So we can think about it as being causal. If this, then that happens. If I throw an apple up into the air, we can predict that the apple is going to fall back towards the earth because of gravity. And we got to remember too that, that scientists are humans. So it makes the analytical mind very comfortable to have a more deterministic worldview. And so when we started to get into the quantum physics space of all of this, and they started to observe elements that we'll get into here, it really shook the core of the physics community. We'll talk more about this, but even Einstein saying that things like entanglement were spooky action from a distance. It didn't fit what was expected. And quantum physics is very much a study of the small. So what's going on at the particle level, and how does that apply to the big? And so really foundationally, you can think about the classical physics as being deterministic. If this, then that. It's local, it's deterministic, it's causal. Quantum physics is probabilistic. It's not one state, one thing is the thing, right? It's a quantized universe where these probabilities are represented by, and so this, as you can imagine, is just two different worldviews, and we're still in the midst, over 100 years later, of trying to reconcile how these seemingly two types of physics unite. And if they do, I mean, we don't know yet. That's still very much under exploration. So that's the really simplest, I think, way to understand it.
Yeah. Okay. So if I'm understanding that correctly, essentially it's like the more you zoom into any matter, as we become subatomic and smaller, the laws that we know to exist, aka classical physics, like gravity and inertia, and I think those are all of the physics buzzwords I can pull out right now.
Good job.
Those laws, thank you. Those laws no longer apply in the same, as you're saying, causal manner. All of a sudden, as we get smaller and smaller and smaller, now laws are applying in a probabilistic,
Yeah. It gets
probabilistic.
weird. It gets
Yeah,
weird
right.
as you get smaller and smaller. Yeah.
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 Okay.
And
Super.
another way to think about it is I can't remember the scientist that originally proposed this, but that light was comprised of particles, so that we could measure light as and perceive light as being particle based. And what we know now is it's wave based. So that's why we study, not we, but scientists study in quantum physics photons a lot of the times. So that's a
Interesting.
kind of another way to think of it. Yeah.
And so that's why, like, because as we zoom in, there is no, I guess, structured set of laws anymore. Things kind of become, like we said, probabilistic. So from that space, is that why, as we relate to the quantum, we think of it as where infinite possibility exists because we don't necessarily know like what could happen, like anything could happen.
Yeah, and we can definitely, this is where we move from this inner scientist into the kind of explorer mindset, which is like, okay, if this is true, and we know quantum mechanics is now, it's no longer a theory. We know that entanglement and superposition and the wave function are all observable, and we know that these things are happening. The big question is, and we can get into this in a bit, is what does that mean? What does that mean for the nature of reality? What does that mean? Especially in my case, I'm very fascinated about what that means for the nature of consciousness. And it's very much a very exciting time as far as that goes, because wherever we land, whatever it ends up being, ultimately, this kind of theory of everything, if you will,
Yeah.
it's no doubt going to be foundational to how we understand the universe, where we've come from, cosmology, and consciousness in ourselves. So it's a very big conversation, but a very exciting one.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's zoom in on some of those concepts you just spoke of. So let's start with superposition. I've heard this term before, but let's dive into what does that really mean?
Yeah, so superposition, the simplest way to understand it is that a quantum system can be in multiple states at once, which is wild, right? The logical, analytical, deterministic mind is very weirded out by that concept.
Yeah.
This is the idea that in Schrodinger's cat, the famous way to explain this is confusing for the analytical mind, that the cat is both alive and dead at the same time until observed, and we can talk about the nature of what that is. But it's this idea that, and we use this in quantum computers, that the qubit can be a 1 and a 0 at the same time. Very simply, that's a way to understand it. And that gives us a huge magnitude of increased possibility and thereby potentially energy. If that makes sense. So that means that a particle can be turned up or turned down. It's another way to think of it at the same time. And then we can talk about maybe if we want to jump to the wave function collapse, this is when the quantum system that's in superposition in this state, it's in the multiple states. The cat is alive and dead. The particle's up and down at the same time. Then it transitions. There's a moment of transition. And this wave function collapse is what there's a lot of conversation around. Like, what is the mechanism that causes the wave function to become a single definite state? That you open the box and the cat is alive.
Right.
That you observe the particle and it's pointing down, we'll say. So the big question, at least in my mind, in quantum physics, is what is that? What is moving us from a state of pure possibility? The wave, which the wave function, it's the way that the physicist, I speak like I'm a physicist. I'm not. Biochemist.
You're an expert. You're whatever you want to be.
But that's the way we represent it. So it's not necessarily, from what I understand, that the cat is like alternating between states constantly, and it's like live, dead, live, dead, live, dead. It's just pure possibility, and then whatever the mechanism of the wave function collapse, then it takes a form. one way or another. And so this is kind of trippy element of quantum physics.
Yeah, up until now, I was like, okay, things, it's not too mind bendy. And now it's feeling a little bit more mind bendy. So let's stick with that example because I read about that this morning, the cat that's both alive and dead. And even then I was like, all right, well, sure, I don't know. But so at any given point in time, like you're saying, before you open the box, a way that I'm thinking about it, and correct me if this is wrong, but it's kind of like both timelines exist at the exact same time. Like you open the box and the cat's alive, or you open the box and the cat's dead, and both timelines exist like parallel to each other. Is that true?
Yeah, well, we start to get into theory here for sure.
Okay.
So yeah, the way I like to be very clear on like what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, good.
But yes, that's where my mind goes,
Uh-huh.
is to what you're talking about. And that's a way to explain the wave function collapse, which what we're talking about now is the measurement problem of
Right.
quantum physics. And this is the big debate, is the measurement problem. If there is, and we know superposition, there's this collapse. What is causing the collapse of the wave function?
Right.
And there's a lot of theories around this, and so we can kind of go through some of the theories here.
Yeah.
And the challenge is that this isn't supported, or it's not predicted by Schrodinger's equation. So we know that from a mathematics.
What is Schrodinger's equation?
Schrodinger's equation is the equation that currently describes quantum physics in this probabilistic events, if you will. Yeah. And so there's what you're talking about, I think, could be classified as one way to explain this, which is really a fun one to think about, which is many worlds theory. And so this theory is one of my favorites. And of course, there's a lot of debate, but it's basically like what you're talking about. It's that when we have a quantum event, that there's a cat that, oh my God, there's a cat that opens the box. Oh no.
Me cat or cat in the box?
I know. Okay. For the sake of not confusing our listeners even more, let's say Crystal. Crystal is opening the box and she observes the cat is dead. I'm sorry, cats. I don't know why we had to choose cats, by the way. Poor cats. But I observe the cat to be dead. So the quantum system has experienced the wave function collapse, and that's been my experience. Many worlds would say that there's another crystal in another universe that is not tied to this universe. So it has its own space and time. And that crystal opens a box and the cat's alive. And so it's one way to explain, at least to the level of my understanding, to be able to accommodate for both possibilities, because that's the thing. If energy is not created nor destroyed, how do we accommodate for the other possibilities? So the timeline, if you want to kind of equate the timeline to this universe idea, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, and it's something that we work with, and we'll get more into the spiritual here for a moment. But like when I go into meditation, sometimes with the intention of timeline shifting, sometimes I can actually perceive this lattice network in my meditation. This is really trippy, but we'll go there for a moment.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, give everybody a warning. But I can, this has happened only a few times, but it's really interesting because I can see this lattice network, and it's almost like I get zoomed into a particular little itty bitty tube in that entire lattice. And I pop into what you could call another world or another universe with other possibilities. So from my own personal, like, experiential experience, that makes me wonder about this theory. It's pretty fascinating. And if it is true, I mean, oh my gosh, what an interesting universe, or universes, megaverse that we live in.
Yeah, that's similarly. I mean, I have not had the experience where I'm zooming into a lattice, and when I'm meditating, that's kind of what my just like higher self intuits, that there are infinite possibilities. We talk about that a lot, but that there are a plethora of timelines that my observation of is collapsing that wave and bringing into reality. And by, as my higher self, tuning into that and essentially choosing that, aligning with that frequency, I'm bringing it into the now, which that's, as from my understanding, it sounds like is still theoretical. That's not proven in in quantum physics yet, right? But that would be the multiple, many Earth or many universe theory that you're talking about.
Yeah, many worlds
Many worlds.
interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where my intuition goes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very exciting, and we'll get into a little bit of this deeper in the podcast in this episode and others. But when we start to think about consciousness and consciousness being quantum, what does that mean for exactly what it is that you're talking about? It starts to make sense that we're able to move into this probabilistic state of being and start to experience experiences and other worlds even that are outside of space and time because of this quantum effect. And this leads really perfectly into kind of the next major element of quantum physics, which is entanglement.
Something special happens when we step away from the noise of everyday life and into a space of amplified presence and deep devotion to our spiritual growth. A space where we're seen, supported, and reminded of the light within us. That is exactly what you'll have the chance to do on our Soul Pod retreat. We are so excited to invite you on this 4-day immersion in Joshua Tree, California, August 28th through 31st. Specifically designed to illuminate your path and harness the light within. From guided meditations under the stars to transformative breathwork journeys, this is more than a retreat. It's a portal into the next level of you. You'll be held in a sacred container with like-minded souls, moving from the earthly into the mystical, expanding your intuition, deepening into your purpose, and activating your true energetic potential. If you're ready to dive into the mystical with us, join Crystal, myself, and the amazing SoulPod team in the desert, under the stars, in the stillness, and beyond the veil. Head to www.soulpodapp.com/retreat to learn more and book your alignment call. Spaces are limited to just 12 light beings for this journey. So if you feel the call, listen.
This is the spooky action at a distance that really weirded out Einstein. And I love how he was such a vocal critic of quantum physics at first, because he was like, we have to be able to interject some sort of hidden, I think he called it hidden variables, that would explain this entanglement phenomenon. And convert it to something that was causal and local, because entanglement is trippy in two entangled particles. So we'll take a photon and we entangle them, and we put them one here on the Earth and one on the moon. Those particles, when they're entangled, have a quantum relationship with each other. And so we can observe one to be spinning up for the sake of simplicity, and we would observe the other one to instantaneously. There's no time element here to also be pointing up. And the reason why this is so absolutely mind-boggling is because we have the speed of light. And that little thing. And the speed of light, space and time, there's limit, we think, to like how fast things can move. And instantaneous interaction is certainly not something that we can easily explain on the science side. So if that interaction it's beyond the speed of light, it's beyond space and time. So that creates a pretty trippy aspect to our reality. And it's another one of those things in science where, and there's probably people that can explain it better than me, but that we know that it happens, kind of like anesthesia, which we can get into. We
Mm.
know that it happens. We know how it works. We don't know how it works. That's my point. We know that it happens. We don't necessarily know the exact mechanism of how it works when it comes to
Mhm.
entanglement. We know we can entangle particles, but how is this happening beyond the speed of light? So, yeah, pretty.
So trippy. And I'm curious, like, well, first of all, how do you entangle particles? And also, what about like spiritual entanglement? Like if you're interacting
Mm.
with somebody or you physically interact with them and your fields are interacting and to what degree do you remain entangled with another entity?
Yeah, that's the spiritual side of this. The how, there's probably people that can explain that better than me, but we think on some levels to entangle particles requires some level of kind of, you could call it ideal environments. So that's why quantum computing is a lot of times you'll find that in highly controlled
Mm.
low temperature, low moisture environments to be able
Mm.
to entangle these particles. And
Okay.
then there's also certain systems that are more decoherent than others. And so there's different levers that you can use to try and increase that coherence and the stability of the quantum system. We already use this concept, these physics, in so much of our technology, and we'll go deeper into it with other experts in the future here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And to your question about being entangled in somebody else's energy, I mean, anybody who's been doing spiritual work for a while would have experienced these moments
Mm-hmm.
where you are entangled with other energy, higher consciousness. And maybe this is actually a good segue to your question. Is this one of these theories of consciousness and how it
Mm-hmm.
intersects with quantum physics that I would love to highlight so our listeners can start to get familiar with this concept? Because for me, it really opens up the possibility. But this theory was developed actually in the 90s by Roger Penrose, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and anesthesiologist Stuart Hemmerhoff. And it's a pretty cool story on how this theory came to be. And it has been written off for quite a while in the scientific and the physics community. But because of some of the recent research, this is starting to kind of come back up to the top of discussion, which we can talk about. But basically, you have Penrose, who's a world-renowned physicist, and then you have Hemmerhoff, who is an anesthesiologist. Hemmerhoff was starting to discover that there was this really interesting structure in the brain called microtubules. And they have a tryptophan-based structure. His theory was that there might be quantum effects possible in microtubules in the brain, and the microtubules are within neurons. So they're an aspect of neuron cells. And when he describes this, and so he met up with Penrose, and they had a meeting at Oxford, and Penrose was really fascinated because he had come up with this theory about quantum states in the brain and what he called orchestrated reduction that could explain how quantum states would enable consciousness, that it was foundational, that consciousness was foundational to experience. But he didn't have a mechanism. He didn't have the biological element. And so when he met Hemmerhoff was like, it might be microtubules, And so, and
That
then
might be the
Penrose was like,
missing piece here.
yeah, it was like a missing piece story. So
Uh-huh.
really, really a pretty cool story that you can read more about. But one of the things about anesthesia that's so fascinating is that, again, we know anesthesia works. Many of us have gone under
Yeah.
anesthesia. You know that it knocks out your conscious experience. The crazy thing is, and when I found this out, I was like, no, we don't know the mechanism. We don't know the exact mechanism for why anesthesia works the way it does.
Yeah, they're just
Which
giving it to us. Like, we just know it works. Don't ask how.
we know it works. We know that it's not toxic
Yeah.
and that there's efficacy there and it's safe, but the mechanism is unknown. And what does that sound familiar to?
I don't know.
It's not to put you on the spot. I get too excited. No, it sounds familiar to quantum entanglement.
Yep,
We
that was
know
I
that
was
it
gonna say that.
happens. We know that it happens and the wave function collapse, we don't know exactly why or how it happens. So I find that fascinating, drawing that kind of relationship. But in the last year, there's been studies, anesthesia studies, where they've looked at these areas in the brain, and they have discovered that there's quantum states that are sustained. They observe this, it's called super radiance. And with anesthesia, these quantum states are suppressed. So it's a very initial indicator, and there's more research that's needed for sure. But it's this initial indicator that there's quantum states, first of all, that are sustained in the brain, which is contrary to what many scientists had thought, because the brain is hot, wet, and it's humid. It's not a quantum computer, right? Which we have all these crazy ways of sustaining stability in quantum systems through those very tightly controlled parameters in the environment. And now we're starting to see maybe that's not true. The quantum states can be sustained in the brain in these microtubules. And one of the reasons could be, as Hemmeroff describes, microtubules are, it's almost like an oil-based structure. So oil and water repel each other. So there's a couple different ways that maybe we could explain this. But if this is true, then what could that mean for consciousness? And that's really where I get excited.
Yeah. So let's play with that. What could that mean for consciousness?
Yeah.
Crystal.
Yeah. So it gets pretty complex pretty fast when you dive into some of these theories. But if it's orchestrated reduction, it's the best way I've heard this explained. It's almost like the microtubules in the brain are all musicians, and they're all playing their own notes, all kinds of these different possibilities. And then the conductor, or the orchestrated reduction action, kind of chooses a specific note. So it's observing a certain state, and then the symphony in the brain kind of collapses. All those notes collapse into a conscious experience is one way, a very technical way to try and explain what that could mean from the objective reduction perspective. And there's an element of gravity, which I'll be honest, I don't entirely understand how gravity gets into the mix in a way that could try to explain how the wave function collapses and creates consciousness. But I think the most interesting for me personally is that if quantum states are sustained in the brain, and then it's not just neural electrical activity, which we've always tried to explain consciousness as causal, just like with the classical physics, that these neurons fire in a certain way and that creates conscious experience. But if the brain has a quantum component, then that means that we can interact non-locally.
Right.
I mean, that's just what it has to mean on some level, is that we can interact and we can quite literally entangle with other information and other possibilities. So Hemmeroff actually himself talks about this, that meditation, when you get into a mystical experience, and maybe psychedelics as well, they accelerate the energy in the brain if we can, and it seems like we now have evidence that we can sustain these quantum states in the brain, that meditation, psychedelics, these channels of altered consciousness, what's happening is that our brain waves, or the energy in the brain, is accelerating to such a magnitude that it increases our capacity for quantum entanglement. And when we move into an increased conscious experience of entanglement, then that could explain that now you're entangling with another possibility, another world, another being even. You're no longer localized to the strict causal activity of neurons in your brain. You're starting to move quite literally into the quantum state, the quantum field, where these different possibilities and experiences and beings exist. And that could be one way to explain and demystify the mystical experience, the out-of-body experience, and the ability for our minds, for anybody who's had those extrasensory beyond the human senses experiences, this could explain it, is that you're having a quantum event.
Right. So what I'm hearing is, if consciousness is fundamental and we're able to sustain quantum states in the brain, then essentially we're just so much more powerful than we think, than we know. Like, because like you're saying, we can not manipulate reality, but we can place our intention on into and onto these, if you will, different timelines, or these different realities, basically the realm of infinite possibility. We can place our intention and make that reality just
Yeah.
by entering these altered states. So like these altered states, whether it be meditation or plant medicine, they ignite kind of this process in the microtubules, like they ignite the quantum states. Okay, so it's like a potential.
Yeah.
It's not like we're not existing in that when we're just in our regular day-to-day kind of beta.
I mean, I think that's probably a big question, and it would be, since they have observed these quantum states in the brain, from what I understand, outside of meditation. My assumption would be that there's always an element of quantum entanglement or quantum activity. I mean, if we could, this is where physicists might roll their eyes, so it's okay. We're exploring part of science too is, and Einstein did a lot of his thinking in this type of extrasensory realm. It's good to talk about these experiences, because as we are seeing, a lot of what spirituality has kind of been pointing to potentially has scientific foundations. And we know that about meditation, because that's what's happened in the last 20 years, is we've been saying meditation's good for you, good for you, good for you. It's expansive, and now we know why. But yeah, my feeling would be that there's always some level of quantum activity in the brain, but it gets amplified through and more coherent, potentially. The whole system of the quantum states in the brain potentially gets more coherent, that could explain the non-linear spiritual experience.
Right. And that is essentially what happens when we quantum leap, for example. It's a non-linear, what would that be? A non-linear kind of influence on what we once perceived as linear. So we make this huge leap in reality, or even in our identity. And that happens because we've entrained with a more coherent kind of quantum
Entrained.
state.
That's a good word.
Yeah, look at me go.
Wow, I like that. Good job. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah, I think that sounds very resonant. That's
Yeah.
what's going on. Yeah.
And I think, kind of to bring this home, like, if anything, even if at any point in this conversation, anyone feels like, they've tuned out, or it's too brain melty, to bring it back, it's like I said, it's a permission slip to step into your power and what's the word? Claim your power. Claim that you are so much more powerful than you might think. And you have so much more impact in creating your reality than you might think. And through, simple rituals, meditation, intentional plant medicine, anything that, again, is creating that coherence, and I'll say it again, and entraining your brain waves with that higher state, your highest self, if you will. Anything that takes you to that space is the vehicle to transformation, into creating a different life, and again, kind of quantum leaping, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such a reminder too, and you're talking about like claiming your power, that simply knowing that this is a possibility, that you have quantum states in your brain.
Right.
I think just that, if that's the only thing that you take from today's
Right.
conversation, is that you have quantum states in your brain. We now know this.
Yeah.
And yes, we got to do more research, but it has been observed. So, holy smokes, what can that mean for you? That you are not necessarily, I don't necessarily think of it as quantum, as you being a quantum computer, but that you are a vehicle for pure possibility.
Right. That you have access to the infinite.
You have access to realms that your linear analytical mind cannot even imagine, and that's the unknown. It wouldn't be mystical if you could. But that is, I think, the ultimate takeaway from this conversation.
Totally.
Is that we're entering this time for humanity where, if you want to, and there's always free will. If you want to, you can start to activate this inner technology within you. And personally, while I think things like AI and these other technological advances are really exciting for certain reasons, I do get worried that we might give some of our power away to these analytical systems. And I hope that we don't forget that the ultimate technology and the ultimate way of knowing is hard-coded into us, and that we can access this with a little bit of practice and some really strong habits. And you can start to tap into these, you can choose to entangle with what you want to entangle with through observation. And that is one of the theories, is that observation or consciousness is the mechanism that collapses the wave function. That hasn't been ruled out yet. So it's a very empowering thing to think about.
Right. And it feels like it also gives us permission to be a little bit more playful with with our practice, and know that we can create and play with the infinite in a way that maybe we didn't give ourselves permission to do before. Maybe we were existing in a little bit more of like a rigid, boundaried causal world, and now we can play with infinite possibility and see what that feels like in our practice, which is so fun. Such a wonderful permission slip to give yourself.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
It's a really cool time.
Yeah. Yeah. So to wrap us up here, if someone's, listened to this and is curious about all of this, and maybe brain's feeling a little melted, but where would you tell them to start playing more? Any favorite books, videos, rituals, just for them to maybe get a better grasp on the quantum?
You can check out all kinds. I mean, I spend a lot of time on some of the scientific shows on YouTube. Different physicists will give talks about the current state of that research. You can look up Roger Penrose's work and theories. You can dive into, there's multiple books out there on quantum mechanics and quantum physics. There's a book on many worlds theory if you want to check that out. On the scientific side, you can stay up to date on what's happening there and the conversations that are happening there. But ultimately, going deeper into your spiritual practice, I think, is the biggest flex, if you will. I don't know if it's a flex, but I don't know why that came to me, but that's what came to me. But as far as making all of this very intellectual conversation real for you, that's going to be the most powerful mechanism, is in your own practice. And bringing this concept into your practice and opening your mind, being in your think box before your practice and reminding yourself of what is possible could be the nudge that you need to take the next step in your practice. A lot of times all it takes is a little bit of inspiration, a little bit more openness, a little bit more courage, and you can break through into that next level of consciousness that's available to you. So yeah, go deeper.
Cool. I love that. And I'm curious, one more question. To what degree did all of these theories, I mean, obviously your whole background, but in creating the journeys and rituals in Soul Pod, as we're playing with elevating our states of consciousness and knowing that this is potential in our brain, how did this go into the creation of Soul Pod?
Such a good question. A few ways that this came into the creation of Soul Pod. One is in the rituals themselves. So it's a little different than maybe in other apps, where we start with breath work. So this helps kind of get our body and minds aligned to begin with, and then moves into a little bit of contemplation. So now we're activating our intention, and then more into kind of a more unfocused expansion, whether that's through mantra or that's through a very simple unfocused expansion practice. But this allows you, now that you've aligned body and mind, you've activated the analytical mind, you're clear about where it is that you're going, basically set that North Star, and now you just allow yourself to meet the unknown, the mystical. So I'm a big fan in my own practice and in teaching to make sure that you give yourself space to release the practice, if you will, and explore. And some days that will bump you into a mystical experience. Some days it's harder than others, and it's like all your thoughts come back in. But the more you practice that, the opportunity is really there. And then on a higher level with the journeys, the first week of our journeys in SoulPod are very focused on exploring new concepts. So we're more in the analytical mind in the first week. We're starting to enter the higher mind. As we go into the second week, it's really becoming personal. And we're looking at the emotional experience, which is part of the way that you can align with that or entangle with that possibility that you want to experience, that you're creating for yourself. And then the third week is kind of taking the training gloves off and expanding more so into the mystical. So I like to give people a lot of opportunities and time. Each day is going to build on the next one to increase your chances of having that next big step in your consciousness.
Yeah, beautiful. I love how just intentional you have been in creating SoulPod. It's such a beautiful offering. Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much for your wisdom and your expertise. Yeah, I feel so blessed. I learned so much. Barely held on at points there, but I learned so much. So thank you for being here. I really hope
Oh my
anyone
gosh,
listening
yeah.
has a better grasp on the quantum and so many more conversations bridging science and spirituality to come.
Yeah, and thank you, Kat. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or send us an email, and we'll definitely be going deeper on some of this in the future.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for journeying with us today, Light Being. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And before you go, we want to invite you to explore the SoulPod app, where you can immerse yourself in daily lessons, guided meditations, and breath work to develop a soul nourishing daily ritual and tune back into your own inner guidance system. You can download SoulPod in the App Store or directly from the show notes to start your free trial today and awaken the ancient wisdom within you.